In solar, we say Bragawatts. So you see all these different developers talking about, my portfolio is 5 gigawatts, 10 gigawatts. And you're like, well, yes, but how much of that is announced versus how much is actually going to materialize?
Hyperscalers, this co-located power story is still like a science project. It's not just about getting power on site, but like you said, Sylvia, there are real and significant operational challenges that come with having that on site.
The term energy transition, it's kind of blacklisted. People don't use it anymore. But now it's becoming more relevant because it's very obvious that economies that are dependent on fossil fuels and all these imports
Welcome back to the Interchange Recharged. I'm your host, Bridget, but today I have a very special guest joining us today. Sylvia, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and thank you so much for holding the fort over the past 6 months. It's been very interesting to be on the other side, just listening and not necessarily asking the questions. So I'm really excited to be back.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're back. It's been an interesting adventure for me hosting the podcast, and I'm sure it's been just as interesting listening in, like an out-of-body experience. But you've had a lot on your plate. You have a new baby and everything that comes along with being a working mom. How's it going?
Well, the working mom part technically just started a couple weeks ago, so I'm still learning that side. But yeah, the past 6 months has been I did nothing related to energy aside from trying to listening to the podcast, which is a bit hard with sleep deprivation. But I'm still learning, right? So keep learning, getting up to speed on what's going on in the energy space right now. And in parallel, just learning how to be a working mom, which is also something completely new for me.
Speaking of like keeping up with industry, I'm sure that that's difficult, but you've kind of been easing back into it now, doing the podcast as well, or coming back to doing the podcast rather. What have you noticed any trends or threads that you want to talk about kind of in today's episode as we catch up on the past couple of months that I've been taking over, and then as you come back into the show?
So you have to be living under a rock to not be talking about data centers. I feel that is not necessarily a new theme. It's something that we started exploring right before my maternity leave, but the conversation is evolving. So there are more discussions about how are we going to meet this new load, how are utilities, regulators, in general, different stakeholders thinking about this new load and trying to match that with availability of supply, which maybe a couple years ago was not necessarily an issue, but it's something that has been brought up in more and more conversations over time. So I'm excited to keep exploring that and just maybe have a quick recap of what you explored on data centers in the show.
Yeah, totally. And I should also mention that I started off hosting this podcast as being an analyst for hydrogen, but I've just moved to a new role within WoodMac focusing on data centers, which honestly feels like a natural reflection of where the market is at and also what I've maybe selfishly been focusing on over the podcast on the past couple of months. I think you're right. Now is the perfect moment to kind of recap what we've been focusing on over the year so far. And I think a good place to start is with the sheer scale of what has been happening in industry so far, just how much capacity is being announced and how fast things are moving. And I remember one of the first conversations that I had on the podcast was with Chris Seiple, Vice Chair of the Americas at WoodMac, who focuses very closely on the data center growth that we've been seeing and made some great comparisons for what we're seeing in the market today and how that compares historically.
U.S. utilities have had no load growth over the past 15 years. Like literally the rate of demand growth in the U.S. power sector was about 0% per year. All of a sudden you have this demand growth occurring and utilities don't have a culture of being ready and prepared to deal with demand growth. The last time we can find that kind of the industry went through something like this was back in World War II. And so in 1939, at the start of World War II, all of a sudden an enormous amount of new electricity demand growth happened to support the manufacturing that was necessary for all the armaments to support a war. And again, it had that element of surprise.
And I think another number that surprised me as well is for the growth that we're seeing, it's about 435 megawatts every month of new capacity that's being announced in the data center industry, which is, just to put that into perspective, enough power to power a city of 400,000 people. But that's just the announcements, which I think is a good asterisk to put on that figure. It's an impressive amount of growth that's being announced, but maybe a bit reminiscent about the hype of hydrogen announcements that we saw a number of years ago.
Yeah, I don't know if in hydrogen you have the same term, but in solar we say Bragawatts. So you see all these different developers talking about, my portfolio is 5 gigawatts, 10 gigawatts. And you're like, well, yes, but how much of that is announced versus how much is actually going to materialize? And we're seeing that both on the demand side and how much capacity of data centers is going to come online, but then realistically thinking about supply available, not only from renewables, but in general, the expertise that is required, the amount of people that is needed to fulfill these targets, then the conversation starts shifting and we need to think, well, is this really happening or not?
I think what's surprising as well is the 0 to 100. I know it's not 100% growth, but 0 to 100 in terms of how fast we're moving, these announcements, how much is coming down the pipeline is kind of catching a lot of these utilities by surprise.
Yeah. And that slow reaction is not something new. That already happened with the boom in renewables, the sheer amount of new capacity that was announced and that was trying to interconnect. It seems like I would have thought that utilities were already starting to think a bit more about how to be these quick, or how to have this quick reaction, but it seems that they're lagging still a little bit. But there's definitely interest and deep pockets from the hyperscalers to make this happen. So maybe the story will be a bit different this time.
Perhaps another saving grace of all of these announcements is that they really are announcements, right? And something that I remember hearing from Tom Falcone of the Large Public Power Council earlier this year, that's an association of utilities that collectively supplies about 30 million Americans. He gave a good perspective on, what happens when you start asking for commitment for the supposed demand that's going to come online, asking utilities to invest tens of billions of dollars, just chasing up all of these interconnection requests that might not even materialize, because in some ways, we might be talking about a bubble. And I think that that's unknown as well. And I think industry has started using large load tariffs as a way to shake out which of these interconnection requests are real versus which are just people holding a spot in line. And Tom gave us a really good indication of what happens when you start asking people for commitments.
Yeah, about 2/3 of them go away. Yeah. So, about 2/3 just go away. I mean, we've seen that overwhelmingly. We've seen that among our members. We've seen it among investor-owned utilities. I mean, we had a large hyperscaler, to go unnamed, come to one of our last CEO meetings. We were talking about load forecasting and put in front of the hyperscaler a load forecast from a data center and what the request was from the data center, what the actual was. And the actual was about half the request. And, the fellow was honest. He said, well, think about it. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know, our need for power depends on our business. Our business is not certain. How fast is the demand? How well do the products pick up? We don't know out 10, 20 years what our actual need is.
And that example that Tom gave was from Ohio. That 2/3 example is from Ohio, but we are seeing the same pattern kind of play out everywhere. In PJM in the Midwest, we saw that large load that is committed or under construction is running at roughly 3 times what the accredited capacity in the risk generation queue is. So about 78 gigawatts of committed or under construction load against around 26 gigawatts of risked or accredited capacity. So that same kind of 2/3 trend. And as we said earlier, regulation is kind of playing catch up here. And a lot of jurisdictions are working through this exact issue right now, in each landing on their own set of requirements for these requests.
I find it really funny what Tom said about committing 10, 20 years in advance, so to say, because that's not new. I mean, it's a new industry starting to think about these long-term commitments. But for example, right now for the renewable side, you need to commit money now for a project that may start construction over the next 5 to 7 years. Then you need to wait until the actual asset starts operating, so you know how well it's going to perform, what maintenance you're going to need. You need to think long term. So perhaps there are some lessons learned from the renewable side that can help the data center discussion and see, okay, what has already happened there? How are we facing the issues with interconnection, long-term view of investment, so on and so forth, and just try to make both utilities, but also developers and investors more at ease, perhaps, on these new investments.
Yeah, and I think it's this like explosive growth, this, we don't know what's happening 10 or 20 years from now. I mean, that's also on the data center developer, that's on the hyperscalers. They have probably their own forecasts internally, of course, about how much of a bubble they think AI is and what it's not. But they need to plan for growth, right? They're right now, there's no penalty for kind of reserving a place in line. And that's exactly what regulatory bodies should be figuring out.
And for those data center developers that don't have a curve, you can reach out to Woodmac and to Bridget, who's probably going to be working on this. So
yeah, thanks. New business. Thanks, Sylvia.
So there is all these new demand, which we know is speculative, and not all of that is going to come online. But how are you seeing, or what have you heard about the utilities' ability to build fast enough to meet all these new demand and couple it with available supply?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, or even maybe billion or $1 trillion question. You can build these data center facilities in 2 years or less, and we've seen crazy timelines for the ambition that these facilities have to come online.
Yeah.
But power generation, well established, it's going to take its sweet time. It's going to take maybe 5 years, 10 years, who knows? And that gap is the whole reason why these developers and these hyperscalers have stopped waiting on the grid and started seriously taking a look at behind the meter power, or around the meter power, which can mean, on-site generation or near-site generation.
Could you tell me more? Because there was an episode on this particular topic. And historically, I remember when talking to developers mainly about off-site power or just staying behind the meter, it was not necessarily it didn't necessarily make economic sense. Has this changed, or what has happened?
I think largely it hasn't changed. There's just more ambition and deeper pockets to try to see how they can make it work. and I think my suspicion would be is that, engineers are probably frustrated with the rose-colored glasses of these developers and hyperscalers saying, oh, it's easy. We just want to, operate our utility right next to the demand. Let's do it. And the engineers are saying, well,
vote it.
The actual load and the way that the load profile operates for AI data centers for these large language models, whether it be training or for inference, has a very unique profile. But I think I had a really good conversation with Akhil Batheja from Bloom Energy, and I knew them. I knew Akhil from doing my work in hydrogen, talking about solid oxide electrolyzers, but they also do solid oxide fuel cells. And over the past 12 months, they've made a huge name for themselves with their solid oxide fuel cells, with a couple of deals that they've done in data centers. Most notably, their stock has just gone, it's been one of the best performing stocks in the market over that period. But Akhil shared a really interesting quote from a study and a survey that they had done in chatting with data center developers. He starts with a question.
What percentage of data center developers would consider 100% on-site power data center? And the answer was a measly 1%. Just last week, when we published our latest version of it, that number's already up to 33%.
Wow.
That 1% that he mentioned was from April 2024. That 33% was from a study that they had done earlier this year. And we see that shift showing up in our data at Woodmac as well. In our latest research report about this around the meter generation, we saw that 35% of US data center project capacity that was announced in 2025 was planned with around the meter on-site or near-site generation in mind. And that is a huge jump up from previous years.
Something to caveat, though, is that what Akhil said was consider. I think that's a key word, right? So 33% of those interviewed would consider it. But then when you think about perhaps the technical reality, the economic reality of these announcements, then probably that percentage would decrease. And basically, I'm not sure if the industry has fully dimensioned how complicated it is to be coupling generation with load centers such as a data center just because of the sheer load profile that they have. It's not only the power, but also the curve. And basically, you need to optimize the operation of a power plant. And on top of that, you need to optimize the operation of the data center as well. So how do you manage that? I guess that's something tricky that the industry is still figuring out.
100%. And announcements are one thing. What's actually happening on the ground, what's actually operational is a completely different picture. And I think something that we've heard over and over again in the recent 2 months that I've started covering data centers is even for the deepest pocketed hyperscalers, this co-located power story is still like a science project. It's not just about getting power on site, but like you said, Sylvia, there are real and significant operational challenges that come with having that on site.
One of the last pieces that I was reading before going on maternity leave was about the complexity of the load profile of data centers. I remember one number, or actually a couple of numbers, like there you can see a 30% drop in demand in 5 minutes. So it's like, okay, suddenly it's not just you're turning off a light. It's like an entire, I don't know what it is, like an entire set of computers that suddenly stops working or just pausing because the processing power is not needed at that particular point in time. Or when thinking about it in megawatts, like 190 megawatt drop in 3 minutes. How do you handle that? And when you think also about the power that is coupled with a data center, there are some that can still react that quickly, but you need a very sophisticated battery. Perhaps a fuel cell could also help there, but then the economic part comes in. So there's just one variable to consider versus the other, and just making things extremely complex to operate, so to say. And actually, Kay Aikin, CEO and founder of Dynamic Grid, explains this very, very clearly.
All the little devices you were talking about, IBR, which is inverter-based resources, and they actually, in aggregate, have very many of the same oscillations and feedback behavior that the large data centers have. They just have it in mass. For instance, Spain was a prime example. They had a whole pile of integrated base resources that created oscillations in the grid and just compounding on themselves and caused the whole grid to go down.
So let's break that down, because there's a couple points to be made, right? We've been talking about AI load swings, but also a lot of these inverter-based resources as well, as Kay said, in aggregate, act very similarly. So this also isn't new. And I would add that something that I found surprising, mostly because of my lack of power background perhaps, was that whether it be on the big transmission grid or even in a microgrid, any kind of rapid ramping like this, whether it be supply and demand balance at a huge scale or a small scale, creates serious operational headaches. It's simply not as easy to just drop power on or near a site. And we did recently publish a Horizons piece exactly talking about data centers and what it's like, the challenges with colocation. We will put a link to that. It's free. It's in the show notes. We'll put it there so you can read it if you're interested. But what makes all of this particularly tricky is that a large array of power electronics, which is exactly what you find at scale in a data center, can amplify weak grid conditions that already exist but aren't yet felt by the consumer. And so this isn't theoretical either. We've seen examples of these subsynchronous oscillations and harmonics that Kay mentioned in that quote in practice today. In 2017, that Dominion example, that was a data center that caused subsynchronous oscillation on Dominion's system, which ran undamped for roughly 2 hours before operators were able to intervene. And similarly, in Virginia, in 2024, there were several large data campuses that simultaneously failed over to backup power after detecting a brief and what was ultimately a harmless grid abnormality. And that swing over to backup power resulted in disruption to the supply and demand balance, nearly causing a statewide blackout. And so whether it's new data center loads or the rapid growth of inverter-based solutions, the grid just needs better tools to manage these swings. And we've had 2 guests on the show this year, well, in the past 6 months, raising the alarm about something specific, which is, as we retire coal and gas plants, we are losing the, mechanical immune system of the grid, which are the spinning rotors, these massive pieces of equipment that inherently provide physical inertia to the grid. And the team from ABB came on to explain a few weeks ago what a synchronous condenser is in the first place, but why they're having a renaissance right now as we're talking about more inverter-based solutions and data centers coming online.
The response is based on physics. If there is a frequency change, the response will be based on this change in physics, change on the rotation of the machine. The inertia will be provided. No control functionality, purely physics.
That's a very interesting quote from Christian Payerl from ABB. And I love this because I'm a physicist by training. So anyone that mentions physics and energy, I'm a big fan. But it's interesting to see that you really need this coordinated portfolio of different solutions, right? So you have supercapacitors, you have UPS or uninterruptible power supply, catching all the millisecond swings that are characteristic of a data center. And you have all these different solutions that are helping to handle voltage or handling harmonics. Synchronous condensers are supplying all the necessary inertia to the system. And in general, what I can tell is this is a mix of different solutions that is needed. It's not purely a hardware issue. It's not purely a software issue. At this point, we need anything we can get to solve or try to solve at least the issues that these new load and its volatility are bringing to the grid.
There's a good saying that I like, which I didn't hear of until I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Throw the kitchen sink at it, which just means anything you need.
I like it. That's where the kitchen sink cookies come from. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If the grid takes 5 years to catch up with the power that you need for these data centers right now, what do? If you've got all the money in the world, you're a hyperscaler, you build it yourself, but you probably want to build it such that you're not locked into a single bet, particularly now that we're seeing a lot of data centers deploying, gas-based solutions. And I think that the theme that I heard most frequently to this extent was modularity, such that you can account for what we were talking about earlier in terms of what's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years? Is this a bubble? How much do I need to build out? But also the fuel flexible bridging that we also see starting to pick up traction. Still not at the forefront, but really over the past year has started to get more traction, particularly with those natural gas fuel cells that can transition. And when we spoke with Shannon Miller, CEO and co-founder at Mainspring Energy, earlier this year about their linear generators, she put the logic really well.
And what our technology allows utilities to do is solve for today's needs and not necessarily have to anticipate what's going to happen 15 years from now. And you can right size the installation to be today's use, not overextend the costs, and then continue to build out as needed.
And that example was talking about National Grid deploying their solution as normal power, not necessarily for data centers. But we did hear the same thing from Akhil again on Bloom's fuel cells, who are partnering with data centers. He described them as Lego blocks, even how modular they are. And when you have this kind of modular building block, it does indeed allow developers to be flexible in figuring out what expansion would look like, utility, hyperscaler, whoever. What do I do if I need more equipment? Well, you just buy more Lego bricks. And I think that that will be an advantage for this kind of solution, but there will also be risks.
So just taking it back to this promise, not only of the data centers, but the supply behind it, and particularly on the behind the meter side. We have seen that about 92% of these deals are struck between infrastructure developers and the behind the meter turnkey providers. So the actual tenant or the people that are going to be using this power is going to be secured later. So this is the first going in blindly. So, okay, who's going to be using this power? And there is this demand risk that needs to be baked in relatively early in the project, right? And modularity that you mentioned and the fuel flexibility as well are a way for developers to try to hedge that risk. And even if the technology shifts over time, then you have this flexibility that helps bridge these gaps rather than just locking in any future commitments. So developers right now, they are starting to build without necessarily having like a tenant or the ultimate user of that infrastructure. So, which is new in general on the infrastructure side, not necessarily new on the renewable development side, because you start building, you start the procurement, and sometimes later in the development process, you loop in who's going to be the ultimate off-taker. And we're seeing those timelines extend quite a bit as well. So having just that flexibility and modularity that you were mentioned, Bridget, helps these developers with the demand risk and the uncertainty that brings just developing a project without a tenant signed in.
And we've talked about, the scale, the pace of growth that we see now, building on-site power, building in flexibility. But there's also like a fourth option that often gets overlooked that was new to me when I spoke to Nick Chaset about it, which is, don't build anything new. Use what we already have, but just use it more intelligently. And like I said, Nick Chaset, he's the CEO of Octopus US. He framed this kind of flexibility and more intelligent use of the power that we have as the real answer to the affordability problem.
To the degree that we can establish that flexibility is the best way, most effective way, fastest way to deal with the affordability crisis, that's going to give us an opportunity to scale massively, because we're solving the single most significant problem that consumers have. It's the single biggest concern that often regulators have. And if it's a consumer problem and it's a regulator problem, it is a utility problem.
I remember that right before I was on maternity leave, I did an episode on EVs, but not just the EV per se, is how this is actually a residential load and how it can help utilities and it can help the grid operators to manage the grid more intelligently. The grid's already there, the load is there, so it's just a matter of thinking more, intelligently or more in a more sophisticated way on how to leverage this infrastructure that is already there, which is no easy feat, right? But that's exactly the type of small, distributed, flexible load that both Nick and Kay were talking about. And also the same load that Kay was worried about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's like another through line of my time as host, something that I learned about, something that I keep hearing about, which is that, the distribution edge, if you will, these millions of small devices, whether they be batteries or an EV or solar panels, we're building them, but we haven't yet built a coordination layer to orchestrate them.
Yeah. And in that episode, Nick mentioned as well that the world's largest residential BPP is in the UK. So it's not new. We already have a prime example of a model that is already working why aren't we translating this to the US? The EVs are already there. The grid is already connected. There's already some sort of smart solution implemented. But then the issue comes back to regulation. That's something that I definitely like to explore more, because it seems that this is no longer a technical question. Hardware versus software is, what are the tools that regulators are providing to have this type of solutions in place?
And I want to talk more about, I'm wrapping up here. You're coming back as host. I want to talk more about what you'd like to focus on. But before I do, I kind of want to recap with maybe a tricky question for you, but 2 quotes that kind of left me a bit split. 2 guests, 2 very different places that they landed with the kind of forward-thinking question that I asked them both at the end of the episode. We'll start with Tom Falcone, who is the optimist here.
I mean, I think the biggest misconception that I see, especially among policymakers, is that people think that this problem requires ripping up every rule book we've ever done and everything we've ever done over the last 100 years. And it really doesn't. What I'm looking for is just, are we doing the things that we need to do to move as an industry from 0% load growth to 3% load growth? Are we making the right decisions? Are we scraping the barnacles off the hull of all these processes? Are we making the investments? And we'll scale up to an industry that, like we were before, had to build at 3% a year. And probably the biggest thing I'm looking at, though, on how real it is it's real as long as there are 5 or 6 companies that are each spending $100+ billion a year on data centers. So I look at their capital budgets. It's real as long as they're spending money. And so we will adjust and adapt to that. I think the issue the electric utilities have is that if it turns out to not be real, if they cut their capital budgets really quickly, if they turn out to not need, if their business comes out to be different, we don't want our customers to be holding the bag. So I think the industry is scaling up for the challenge. There's plenty of things to look at, but in the end, it's all driven by the capital spending of a handful of companies. As long as they're doing it, then we're going to be scaling up. We'll be just fine. I mean, it does not require a root and branch reorganization of the utility industry because these are not new challenges. They're just different flavors of the same challenge. And I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, I see the path to get there.
And that was Tom's very optimistic point of view. And here is maybe the counterpoint to that, more of a warning that we heard from Kay Aikin.
We're going to have an affordability crisis nationwide. So as rates go up, the more affluent the industrials, which they provide a majority of the dollars to utilities. So the industrials, a lot of my business is industrials. I provide energy storage for industrial companies. And as soon as they manage their own energy, they will be providing less support to the utilities. The more affluent will leave the market. They'll put their own solar cells up, they'll put EV, they'll put storage, and they will in effect grid defect. And who's going to be left holding the bag is going to be those who can't do it. And so that's going to be the affordability crisis. And unfortunately, I think we're getting very close in many jurisdictions into that death spiral.
Okay, Sylvia. So we've got Tom, lover of metaphors, scraping the barnacles versus Kay's death spiral. But both are worried about this bag. Somebody's holding it. Sylvia, what's your reaction to these quotes? Where do you land between these two opinions? As you've been catching up with the market over the past couple of months.
So I feel a bit more inclined towards what Tom is saying, because I am seeing movement from the utility side and the regulators, and I'm also seeing more cooperation among generation developers, data center developers, and the other two entities that I just mentioned. So there is movement there, but Kay has a very interesting point, and it's something that many people are being very vocal about. That's why we're seeing so much community opposition to data centers, and it's a right concern, right? It's something that developers, that anyone in the energy field actually needs to be thinking about who is going to be paying for this. And as we were discussing earlier in the episode, many of these announcements are just that, announcements. So if there is investment there, ultimately, if any project doesn't happen, who is going to be paying for that? So utilities are becoming more sophisticated on how they're thinking about managing these announcements precisely, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty. So that's where case comment comes in. So I think it was a non-answer, but ultimately I'm feeling optimistic about how these synergies are working out, but we need to be very careful because in a scenario like the one Kay just mentioned is something that could completely happen.
100%. And I don't think it needs to be, an opinion yet formed. You still have many podcast episodes ahead of you to explore the same themes that I just started getting into. And so I'll ask you, what Ed Crooks, he's the host of the Energy Gang, our other podcast, what he came on the show and asked me when I first took over in January. What is it that you are most excited to explore over the next couple of months?
There are too many things going on right now in the energy spaces. I've been ramping up. It seems that instead of getting answers, I'm just finding more questions. So there's
That's
a lot
always
to
good.
explore.
No lack of content.
Yeah. Like it keeps things interesting. So data centers are not going anywhere. And I feel that even though it's a conversation that we've been having since last year, there are new things coming up and new ways to explore it. So we touched a bit on the regulation side, so I'd like to explore a bit more on that. We're already seeing self-movement within the US in particular. ERCOT, MISO, SPP, they already have some sort of regulation in place to try to manage this uncertainty that we were talking about. But ultimately, I would like to see how this new ideas or how these regulation is going to affect investment and ultimate materialization of data centers. So I guess like that would be the first topic that I would like to cover, and I would be very excited to see some participation from hyperscalers in this conversation.
And I think what has struck me so far as I've been learning about the data center industry is that the regulatory picture has a bit of a contradiction where utilities are supportive of bringing your own generation, but the generation won't protect you, depending on your jurisdiction, won't protect you from curtailment. And I think that'll be an interesting financial logic to explore because you're trying to bring your own generation, have that co-location model, taking a lot of risk with it, building your on-site power precisely to guarantee the uptime of your facility. And it could potentially be undermined by the very regulators that are helping you accelerate your interconnection pathway. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think there will be a lot of regulatory uncertainty over the next couple of months, maybe even years, hopefully not, especially in the US.
Yeah, and kind of tied to that is the other topic that I like to explore is the renewable supply constraint. So we have seen, at least in the US, a lot of back and forth on what's going to happen with the tax credits, or we kind of already know, but there's still uncertainty of what's going to happen with the projects that are already inline. So just to understand what would be the impact of not having enough renewables on the ground and how that would affect these forecasts on load and explosion from data center. Not only data centers, actually, we have more manufacturing, we have some electrolyzers still. So how this supply constraint is going to be affecting the development of all these new side of the demand. So we have already seen the effect on project delays and cancellations because of all the policy uncertainty. But it's not only the regulation side. We also have the same issue with transformers, other pieces of equipment on top of the legislation that is already quite fuzzy.
As you said, it's not just about renewables. Those transformers are a bottleneck to interconnecting anything, which includes some of the gas generation that these data center developers are falling back on.
We're also hearing that on the labor side, the same people that are building data centers, that are working on the solders, the electricians, they are competing with renewables, they are competing with fossil fuel generation. So ultimately, what is going to be the bottleneck. So that's definitely something that I want to keep on discussing on the show. One other topic that comes to mind is the Middle East conflict, but not necessarily the political side, the impact that it has had on the discussion of energy dominance or energy independence versus energy transition. I think that after this second term of President Trump started, the term energy transition, it's kind of blacklisted. People don't use it anymore. But now it's becoming more relevant because it's very obvious that economies that are dependent on fossil fuels and all these imports, now they're so exposed to fluctuations in price. We already saw that Asia spot LNG price rose 94% since the start of the conflict. Economies like Japan, South Korea, Italy, they're taking really big hits because they are so exposed to these fluctuations in pricing. So on the other hand, we're seeing countries like the US, Brazil, that have a high renewable penetration to be a bit more shielded. And that's because they have an internal energy fleet. That's where the energy independence is coming from. And they're not relying on imports for supplying the electric grid. So I think there's something there to talk a bit more about, and how this conflict and its evolution is going to be affecting how different countries are thinking about energy independence and having this bridge with energy transition.
The energy security part of the conversation is always going to be there, at least for the near term. Any other thoughts that you have for, what you want to bring to the show? I think you said something earlier about the kind of not in my backyard sentiments that we're hearing more and more about data center build out. And that's something that I haven't had yet time to cover in the show. Is that of interest to you as well?
Definitely. There is, I think it's a very interesting dynamic. It seems that on the renewable side, at least, we have already seen some progress on how to handle community opposition and how to better engage with the community at early stages of a project. I'm not sure if that has already happened on the data center side. And I think one of the biggest problems that industry is facing is how do you convince people that this is a good and sound investment in their backyards, but with all the issues, so to say, that data center development comes with. So you have issues with water supply, what's going to happen with the electric infrastructure. And these are questions that I'm very, very interested to hear. How is it getting addressed, and what could we be expecting in the future? And what are the lessons learned from the renewable side that could potentially be adopted to handle this? So hopefully we're going to explore a bit more on that in the podcast in the future episodes.
Sylvia, you've got a full rest of the year. All of those topics sound great. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to listening now instead of hosting anymore. It'll be great to hear how you bring the podcast forward and move on to these exciting topics.
I'm really, really excited to be back. And Bridget, thank you so much for holding the mic for me. It has been lovely to listen to you, to learn more about different ways to explore many different topics in the podcast. And I'm so excited to be back.
Well, Sylvia, how should we do this? Because now I've gotten used to signing off the episode. Maybe I'll just thank everybody, and then you can do the official sign out. Does that sound good?
Let's do that. Love it.
Thank you, audience, for having me as the host for the 6-month period. It has been great. Hopefully I'll come back, maybe a special guest appearance here or there. We'll see. But then I'll pass it over to Sylvia to actually give the real outro to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. And I'll be right here in DC in the next 2 weeks with a regular episode of Interchange Recharge. So don't forget to subscribe and listen to Interchange Recharge wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget that we're on YouTube as well. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.